So, good afternoon once again. Johann Sebastian Bach spent the first 3 years, or a little more, of the time he spent in Leipzig, developing, that is to say, composing, a repertory of liturgical church cantatas that were appropriate to the place, to the forces available to him, to the theology expected of him and his librettists, and to the liturgical calendar, which of course cycled through every year. That meant that for the most part, he could turn his attention after that first 3.5 years to other musical projects, relying on the works and their carefully prepared performing parts that he already had at hand. Occasionally he got inspired to add to that repertory of cantatas, or more likely, occasionally got caught out without an appropriate piece. And something like this probably happened in the early summer of 1732, on the fourth Sunday after Trinity. Now, Bach had a piece for this liturgical occasion from Weimar. It's Barmherziges Herz der ewigen Liebe, BWV 185. And in 1723, his first year in Leipzig, on that liturgical date, the fourth Sunday after Trinity, he performed that work along with a new piece, Ein ungefärbte Gemüte, BWV 24, as a double bill for the date, and we heard that piece last season. Bach did not have a work for this occasion from the second cycle, probably because the fourth Sunday after Trinity coincided that year with the Marian Feast of the Visitation on July 2nd, and that feast took precedence. For the occasion, Bach composed Meine Seele erhebt den Herrn, BWV 10, for that occasion, which made a good piece for the Feast of the Visitation, but that left him without a piece in that cycle for the fourth Sunday after Trinity. He apparently did not compose a piece for that occasion the following year either. It looks likely that he was out of town for a few weeks right around that date, perhaps even in conjunction with an audition that he took somewhere else, we're not sure. The music for a few weeks was apparently directed and possibly chosen by somebody else. So Bach probably limped along for the fourth Sunday after Trinity with just the two older cantatas, maybe just doing both every year when that liturgical occasion came around. Perhaps the observance of the Feast of the Visitation continued to take precedence, say even when it fell midweek or just before the Sunday. In 1732, though, he apparently decided to do something about this lack. He composed a new piece. That's our cantata today. The text consists of all 5 stanzas of a late 16th century hymn. Now, most curiously, we have a libretto print from the Leipzig churches in the year 1725. That's the year when Bach might have composed a piece for this, but turns out probably to have been out of town. And strangely enough, it says in that liturgical text print that the cantata performed then had precisely the text you have in front of you. But it can hardly have been by J.S. Bach. It certainly wasn't this piece that we just heard, because we've got a dated and entirely datable autograph composing score that makes it clear that this piece was composed in 1732. We're not really sure what that was. A composition by somebody else, we really do not know, but it's apparently when Bach went looking for a libretto to set in 1732, he chose that perhaps because the text had already been used for that purpose. Now we can tell from the way he filed this piece and the way it was inherited by his heirs that Bach considered this cantata part of the 1724-1725 annual cycle. That's the one based on Lutheran hymns that we've talked a lot about this year in its 300th anniversary. At least that was the pattern for the first 40 weeks of the year. As we've discussed, the librettos apparently ran out. And it's worth considering for a moment the implications of that. Composers typically did not write the text of their church cantatas. There were a few who did, but that was a rare exception. Church cantata librettos were the work of poets. Some were theologians or clergymen, some were not, but all worked in the same way. They assembled scriptural texts, particular hymn stanzas, and to those they added newly written poetic texts designed to be set as recitatives and arias. And all these together yielded the up-to-date so-called mixed text cantata libretto. These librettos were dominated by poetry set as recitatives and arias, as were, of course, the resulting compositions. Bach's 1724-1725 chorale cantata cycle is an interesting twist on this. Each day's cantata, as we've discussed a number of times in here, is based on a chorale. The first and last stanzas are retained with their melody, and that prompts an opening and closing movement using that hymn tune. The inner stanzas were mined for their images, words, and ideas, and form the basis of new poetic texts for recitatives and arias, and those constitute the middle movements of the text of this kind of cantata. This is the reason that even a hymn-based cantata needs a librettist, a poet to do that conversion, to come up with the new poetry. And by that work of the poet, a long series of poetically identical hymn stanzas becomes a mixed text type libretto, with outer stanzas intact, and some kind of variety in the middle with recitatives and arias. So that's what happened in 1724, 1725, starting with the first Sunday after Trinity. And Bach, librettists supplied him with these, and Bach composed cantatas on this model through the beginning of Lent. But when cantatas resumed with Easter, there are no cantatas performed during Lent, the so-called Tempus Clausum, this type stops. Bach filled in with some older works, and then with settings of librettos by a local poet, Christiana Mariana von Ziegler, his only female librettist, somebody we've talked about at length in here. These were not chorale-type librettos, they were more typical mixed text-type pieces. The hypothesis is that the librettist who had been supplying these chorale librettos passed away. That's a possible clue to his identity, but it's not certain. Now, over the years, Bach went back and filled in some of the missing dates. For the sixth Sunday after Trinity, for example, he said a typical chorale cantata libretto, probably left over from the 1724-1725 project, but never set to music for some reason. For Misericordias Domini, that's one of the Sundays between Easter and Pentecost, he composed BWV 112. That text consists of all the stanzas of a hymn, just set one after the other. Bach's set, that is, the raw material of a chorale cycle libretto, but not a finished chorale cycle libretto because there was no poet around to convert it. He did not have the benefit of a librettist's contribution. Those pieces, that piece, for example, consists of 5 stanzas of the chorale. There's a big opening chorus and a closing simple chorale, and there are 3 aria-like movements in the middle, set to the text of the original chorale verses with all their characteristic features. And of course, as you've seen and heard, that's exactly what we have here today. Same cantata. The original 5 stanzas of the hymn are set as though they had been transformed into a mixed text libretto. The opening chorale setting of the hymn and its closing simple harmonization are familiar and frame the piece. And then there are 3 aria-like movements in the middle, treating the chorale verses as though they were aria poetry. It's a little hard to know whether to call them arias. The term aria actually in the early 18th century meant a short poem designed to be set, for example, as a concerted piece of the kind we've been hearing. These are musically very much like arias, but probably wouldn't have been called that because their texts are chorale stanzas. So what, you might ask? The chorale stanza is a poem, just like an aria text. Composer can just ignore the tune and set the words as an aria. Well, that's true, and Bach indeed does this. But it leads to some unusual results and can give us some insight into what makes up an aria text. First of all 3 inner movements are prosodically exactly the same. Of course, they have the same number of lines, they observe the same poetic meter, the same rhyme scheme, and they observe the same overall construction of 2 lines plus 2 lines plus 5 lines for this hymn in particular. Now, that does not provide the kind of automatic variety of declamation and structure and other features that you probably hope for in a well-constructed libretto. They are all the same in these features. These hymn stanzas are also not built for the very typical return of their opening lines, as so many aria texts are. Many aria texts are designed so that it makes sense to have their opening line or lines come back, sometimes in a structure that'll have a couple of lines, a few lines in the middle, and then a literal return, musical and textual, of the opening lines. That's not the case here. They simply don't work that way. So the three arias here in our piece, I'm going to call them arias despite my caution, the three arias here go through their text with no return. Now that's a normal type, but very rarely do you get three of those in a row in a Bach cantata. He will usually try to make some variety that way. Three arias in succession is rare enough, in fact. Usually there's a mix or an alternation of recitatives and arias, but there are no recitative texts provided here, of course. There's no aria text either. Bach just decides to use them that way. We know from experience that even in Bach's hand, writing a simple recitative, that was a declamatory vocal piece with just basso continuo accompaniment, to a rhymed metrical poem leads to some very odd results. It just sounds a little strange, even when a composer is going out of his way to try and hide that construction. Recitative texts are blank verse, with usually not rhymed until the very end, and usually with varying line lengths and accent patterns. So it sounds a little bit more like stylized speech. When you hear a regular metrical chorale stanza set as a recitative, you can hear it sort of tripping by as it goes, and it seems to clash with the musical implications of a recitative. The text of these arias, what become arias, don't necessarily stand alone very well. Usually, among other things, you expect an aria to have a striking or a catchy opening of some kind. The second stanza of this hymn, the first aria, effectively begins, "and another thing." Right? That's not the greatest opening line for an aria. Right? Each stanza covers a lot of territory. It's got several topics. It's very difficult to sum up each of these in a few words. None is well focused on a particular image, or even more importantly, none is well focused on a particular affect, a particular human emotional state. Those are what an early 18th century composer usually latches onto in writing an aria, and what a good librettist will in fact provide in an aria text, even in an aria text derived from a hymn stanza. That's largely missing here. Then there's a matter of structure. This is a tune that goes A, A, B. There's a couple of lines set to a melodic unit, two phrases, and then those are repeated with two more lines, lines 3 and 4. And then you go on to new melodic material for the rest of the stanza, A, A, B. So 2 lines, 2 parallel lines set to the same notes. That turns out to be very difficult for most composers to ignore musically. In the opening movement, for example, which does set the tune, there's an opening instrumental ritornello, then settings of 2 lines, followed by an exact musical repeat of the ritornello and essentially of the setting of the lines of text. The final simple harmonization is similar. You get lines 1 and 2, and then a literal musical repeat with the new text written under it for the vocalists. So you get A section repeated, A section repeated, and then the B section. There is a literal repeat at the beginning. Arias do not tend to do this. Sometimes they'll repeat their text with similar musical material as they work their way through it, but there's rarely a literal repeat in the same key. Very rarely goes back to the home key and just starts again with another 2 lines, except in a few special cases, arias that present themselves a little bit differently. The first and third arias here have exactly that musical repeat. It's especially audible in the last one, the one with solo violin and bassoon, where you can hear the violin and bassoon beginning again that beautiful duet recitative, duet ritornello in the home key. I think you can learn to recognize that. The first and third arias here have musical repeats. Bach clearly felt some pull of the chorale structure of these verses and decided to honor it with a musical parallelism there, which makes these pieces stand out from typical arias. So what does Bach do with the other problems of this libretto? First of all, he appears to have been striving for musical variety of a kind that wasn't automatically suggested by the text. There's one continuo aria, one with a solo obbligato, and one with a duet obbligato. There's one for alto, one for soprano, one for tenor. There's one in a minor key and 2 in major keys. 2 are in duple meters, 1, 2, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 in a so-called compound meter, in which you've got a triple subdivision of 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, and so on. So there's some rhythmic variety, metrical variety. There's a kind of escalation of affect as you move through them. There's a somber first aria that's a plea, I would say a somewhat more neutral second aria, and a joyous third one. To a large extent, if you read the words, these are imposed on the text by the composer. And it shows there, I think, the imperative of an aria projecting an affect. That's what a composer is after. That's what a librettist is really supposed to supply, and the hymn stanzas here that Bach has to work with don't really make that easy. Second thing Bach does is to fill this cantata with an unusual number of beautiful details of instrumentation, beyond what you find in almost any other work. We can start with the last aria, this duet obbligato for solo violin and bassoon. That's a somewhat unusual pairing to begin with. It combines a solo violin, which you've already heard in the opening movement, we'll come back to that, with a concerted bassoon line. Now, that instrument has not been heard in the cantata before this movement. It's in its own part, it's in J.S. Bach's own hand, it's an autographed part, and it starts with this movement, making it clear that he did not ask the bassoonist to play, say, basso continuo in the earlier movements. He simply didn't. The bassoon plays this movement. Interestingly enough, it then includes the final chorale as well, which turns out to have interesting implications as well. But here's one instrument we've been introduced to, the solo violin, earlier in the piece, and one instrumental color, the bassoon, solo bassoon, dropped in here for variety. This is a special instrument for a special movement. This piece has an elaborate trio sonata texture in the instruments. The violin and the bassoon trade off material in a characteristic modular way, frequently presenting music that's idiomatic to the other instrument. So there's a florid bassoon line and a bouncy octave violin line that kind of sounds as if it's, well, it did start out the other way around, but Bach shows you kind of swap them. So he's making you listen to the instrumentation here by presenting idiomatic material for each, and then showing you can make interesting music by swapping those and giving each other's ideas. Now, it's a cliche to say that Bach's vocal lines are instrumental. It's been a cliche, in fact, since his own time when that complaint was made of him. But it really is true in this aria. The emphasis is on the participation of the voice in the virtuosic instrumental texture of the solo violin and the bassoon, rather than on its own vocal melodic character. The only really independent vocal writing here is in the strange setting of the last line, musically odd moment indeed, as you would probably recall. The middle aria also calls for an instrument not heard elsewhere in the cantata, the so-called oboe da caccia. That's a tenor instrument pitched a fifth lower than regular oboe. It's curved, largely to make the long instrument reachable for most players, and it's got a flared bell at the end, either metal or a little bit later, especially wood. That's the instrument. This is most prominent, you might, if you know Bach's works and that sound is familiar to you, the most prominent place it shows up is in many striking movements in Bach's St. Matthew Passion. It's used there a great deal. It offers a striking color. Now, it's difficult to identify a textually derived reason for the use of the oboe da caccia here. It also offers an unusual texture. In this case, because this is a soprano aria and essentially a tenor range oboe da caccia, the obbligato line spends most of its time below in range, below the voice. So you have voice and then obbligato instrument and then basso continuo. That's not the usual order of things. Usually you have a voice and then something above it. So it really gives you a very different kind of texture to listen to here than typical arias. There's one interesting passage, in fact, in the composing score where Bach changes his mind. There was a soprano passage that was at pretty much the same level or even a little bit below the obbligato, and Bach crosses it out and just transposes it up an octave to bring out that very characteristic feature of this piece. The first aria here is simplest in its scoring, just basso continuo. It does more or less quote the first line of the chorale melody, not after the false start that the voice begins, but when the voice starts over again, you can almost hear what the voice sings as a kind of paraphrase of the tune, but then quickly moves away, and over the course of the movement moves further and further away from anything you might identify with our chorale melody. I don't know if Bach is making a point here or it was just an interesting place for him to start. The three arias are distinguished from the outer movements in another aspect of their instrumentation as well. That is the instrument for keyboard continuo participation. The organ is instructed to be silent in those three movements. It says organ tacit. Organ is silent here. It's just a little filler in the original organ part. That happens frequently in Bach performances, especially in the early 1730s. As we've discussed earlier this season, we presume there was, in fact, keyboard basso continuo realization in those movements, probably harpsichord, but this is not certain. We've assumed that that's the case here, and you will have heard the outer movements with organ continuo and the 3 inner arias with harpsichord. It helps distinguish those movements without the chorale melody from the outer 2 with. There is detailed attention to instrumentation is a big part also of the opening movement. It's a concerto with an elaborate ritornello that then it alternates, that ritornello, that piece of instrumental material, alternates with the chorale presented phrase by phrase, melody in the soprano, mostly prepared and supported by the lower 3 voices. The ritornello is itself texturally and complex in its instrumentation. Within the ritornello, you hear a contrast of tutti scoring with a really interesting texture with solo violin, and those solo violin passages are usually without basso continuo. There's no low bass line. There's a bass function provided by middle range instruments. It's called bassetto, little bass. And that textural contrast finds its way into the vocal segments as well, the ones that are articulated by ritornellos. The 3 lower voices are associated with the solo violin, and they have a sparse bass line. Without organ, Bach says the organ remains silent during those first vocal entrances. And then the big tutti texture comes back when the chorale melody comes in. So you've got that sparse texture with solo violin contrasted with a tutti texture, both in the ritornello and as a feature of the vocal segments as well. Here's another detail of instrumentation to listen for, and that is what you might call the dual loyalty of the oboes in this movement. They are part of the ritornello, but as soon as a chorale melody, a chorale phrase comes in, they switch to playing the chorale, and it's a really beautiful doubling of 2 unison oboes with our soprano, especially worth listening for. And then the oboes will switch back to the ritornello duties, going back and forth. It's almost as if there were 4 oboes here, 2 doubling the soprano and 2 participating in the ritornello. That's a lot to keep track of. And it's part of a tendency, I would say, in this cantata, to let musical features do some of the work that a carefully crafted libretto might ordinarily do in a cantata. Bach is not a librettist. Given the need to write a cantata, though, he works with the musical tools he has.
beständig sein, weil gib mir du uns allein in Händen, du uns allein in Händen.